Okay, let's talk about the last thing I have here for Lumen Gentium. The Pilgrim Church, the eschatological nature of the church. Lumen Gentium talks a lot about the church being on this progress, on this way toward perfection throughout time, and it will achieve perfection in the end times. What do you have to say about that?
That the church will achieve its perfection in the eschaton in the end times?
Yeah. So again, eschaton, that's like the end times, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so eschatological nature of the church. The church is by nature oriented toward the end times. It is something that is to prepare us for our last end. And Thomas Aquinas says our last end is God himself. Okay, so the church is oriented toward this. It is supposed to get us to our last end, which is God himself.
This is something that is very prevalent in the patristics. They had a fourfold method. Sometimes not everyone had a fourfold method, but by and large, it was a fourfold method of interpreting scripture. There was the literal sense, what the author intended historically. And then there was the spiritual sense, which was broken up into the allegorical, moral, and anagogical. Allegory, typology, how maybe something in the literal sense points me to Christ or the church. Moral, of course, what moral applications can I derive from this? And then here's the part, anagogical. How does this point us to last things? Heaven, hell, death, judgment, things like that. How does this point us to the fulfillment of things, how things will be in the eschaton at the end of this age? I think that is definitely there in the patristic area, and Vatican II is trying to bring that back. It's trying to bring back that focus. Not that there isn't an aspect to the here and now. Of course, we have the church militant. We also have the church triumphant and the church suffering.
Do you think it was lacking before Vatican II?
I'm sorry?
Do you think it was lacking before Vatican II? And then
a focus on the eschaton?
Yeah.
I do think that we definitely lost an emphasis in this aspect, especially in interpreting scripture. I'm not saying that it completely disappeared or doesn't exist in our tradition, but there's definitely a shift in the way that we interpret scripture or the way that we view these things in the late Middle Ages and after the Reformation. I think part of it is, of course, just getting away from the Bible in general, which is a reaction to Protestantism and sola scriptura. Along with that came a loss of that fourfold method of interpreting scripture. That could have maybe impacted the way that we see things as far as the eschaton and thinking of the church triumphant and thinking of last things. Not that last things as far as a topic wasn't there prior to Vatican II again, but maybe in the way that it was there in the patristic era, I think wasn't necessarily emphasized. And so Vatican II, what it's doing, especially with its ressourcement theology, is it's trying to emphasize the fact that we need to go back to the sources. We need to go back not only just to the schoolmen and the fathers, we need to go back to sacred scripture itself.
Gotcha. Thank you. So I interviewed Father Richard Chamber from the Pensacola Tallahassee Diocese for season 1 when we went over Dave Arabum, and I feel like it was one of those moments where I had like a paradigm shift with like how I viewed the Bible. It was just kind of what you're getting at here about like what is your orientation. It is not necessarily studying scripture. It is not necessarily like any of these things on earth. Your goal is like to know God and to love him and be with him in eternity, that's like the Baltimore Catechism or something, right? When I was talking with Father Chamber, the paradigm shift there was like, what is the Bible? The Bible is, in a sense, Christ, and it is, in a sense, written by him because like God reveals himself to us through prophets, through scripture, and ultimately in a person, his son, the second person of the Trinity. So like this idea of like where we get revelation from, how do we know God? Scripture is just another mode by which we know God. And then this idea of like what we're talking about here, like your purpose in life, your orientation should be, how do I spend eternity with God? And that is my end goal. What gets me there? Yeah, yeah, awesome.
And Vatican II really helped bring back that focus. It really brought that universal call to the laity to focus on personal sanctity and personal holiness and growth in being a saint. I think prior to Vatican II, there were periods in church history where that was not emphasized. And what Vatican II wanted to do was it wanted to make it absolutely clear everyone has a call to personal holiness. Everyone's called to be a saint.
And to that extent, like, hey, evangelical councils, those are great ways to get there. Devotions, we talked a little bit about what you're going to do during the communion procession. Like these are all things that you can pick up, praying the rosary, doing, you mentioned going to Vespers, like all these are things that you can do that help you toward holiness and being with God. Figure out what you need and do it. Okay. And like that requires a sort of like radical honesty on your part to be like, no, I really do suck at this one thing. This is an aspect in my life where I'm really bad. I need to fix that. Here's how I can fix it. That didn't work. Let's try something else. Hey, that was really good. I'm going to try this other thing. Not working as much. All right, I'm sticking with this item then. That was good for me. And go there. And you know what? It might change in 10 years. And you have to be able to reflect on yourself and see where you are.
Yeah, well said. Absolutely agree with that. Another thing it put forward is, of course, the sacred page, the study of sacred scripture. Yeah. But that was also being presented in the preconciliar period, like I mentioned, with Leo the 13th and then Pius the 12th, among others. So these are some of the benefits, in fact, that I think that we find in the post-conciliar era is more of an emphasis on personal growth and sanctification and the reading of sacred scripture. In fact, there's an indulgence offered for somebody who does,
Read
private
scripture
reading of scripture.
Devotion.
Yeah, right.